So that's Ephesians 2, 11 through 22. We have been working through Ephesians, and the question we've been asking is like, how do you have a first century faith? That's really the lens that we're reading this thing through. Today, what I'd like to do is try to get you guys into this passage, the second half of chapter 2, and I'd like to do it by thinking about this question. How does the gospel heal cultural division? How does the gospel, how does the message of Christianity, the good news thing, how does that actually bring people together? Because that's what this passage is talking about, right? It's saying there were two different kinds of people, but now they're one new kind of person, okay? And I want to unpack what that means. We live in a very divided culture, right? But I want you to remember, in the first century, the Roman Empire was full of very divided cultures, okay? So what we experience today is nothing new or different than what there are going to be some differences, but we are in the same kind of cultural context that the first century Christians were, okay? This passage starts with all sorts of language about divisions. Did you catch that? Like if you look at verse 12, going forward, it says that you were strangers, you were alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, you had no hope, you were without God, you were separated from Christ. You hear all that like separation language, not just from God, but from the Jews. And then what happens in the second part, verse 13, if before they were far, now they've been drawn near. You've been brought near. You were far off, you've been brought near. And then 4 times in these verses, you see the word peace. He himself is our peace. That's in verse 14. Down at the end of verse 15, Jesus has made peace. Verse 16, that he might reconcile us both to God in one body and through the cross. Verse 17, he came and preached peace to you who are far off and peace to those who are near. If you remember, for the Jews, when you heard the word peace, what would Jews have thought? Shalom. But if you were a Roman or a Gentile, when you heard the word peace, you would have thought Pax, Roman Empire. Because the Roman Empire came and said, we're making peace through force, okay? So he's making this claim that speaks to both cultures, and he's saying it's all about peace, it's all about bringing people near to God, but it's also about bringing people near to one another. And then there's that language in verse 15 where he says, making in himself one new man in place of the two. So instead of Jew and Gentile, now there's Christian, and somehow Christian bridges the gap. It's a new and different culture. Okay, most of us see that verse there in 14 and 15. Okay, he's broken down the wall of hostility. He's abolished the law of commandments that he might create in himself one new man in place of two, so making peace. We see that, and you know what we do? We yawn. The first century Christians would have been riveted. They're like, that's why I got into this thing. That's why I'm here in a living room, wherever they are, whether it's in Palestine or it's in Ephesus. They're like, I'm interested in this thing, that there is a new kind of person. And it actually comes with a new culture. So what I want to try to do today is help you understand how the gospel actually does this cultural healing thing, because I think that we need it in our culture today. All right? And what I want to talk about in order to understand how the gospel does cultural healing is I actually want to talk about this thing that I'm going to call cultural narratives. Okay? Does anybody know what that means? If you don't worry. I'm going to explain it to you. So here's what we're going to talk about today. There's the nature of culture narratives. The nature of cultural narratives. There is a problem with cultural narratives. And I want to try to show you how Christianity and the gospel offers a new and better cultural narrative, right? So the nature of cultural narratives, what it is, there's a problem with every cultural narrative. The gospel, rightly understood, gives us a whole new culture and a new narrative. And I want to think about that because how we think about that is going to address how we try to tackle the problems our culture faces. Okay? And then we get to discuss this over lunch. Just one thing that I want to say. As we move to this cluster model, you guys can still ask questions, but it's harder. It's easy for you to ask questions. If you ask, I'm going to try to repeat your question. It's harder for the guys in the other room to ask a question. So in some ways, what will probably happen is I will talk a little more and then we'll really discuss more over lunch. That makes sense? So we may have a little less discussion here, but if you guys in particular hear something that you're confused about, ask, all right? You got the green light because you're in the living room and you're on the couch and that's the pole position. Okay, so before we talk about the nature of cultural narratives, I'm gonna actually start with a little story as an example. And there's a reason why I'm gonna share this. Yesterday, you ready for this? I got to drive a Cybertruck. Okay. Now listen, you're like, why on earth are you, yeah, okay, listen, right there, you betrayed your own value. Okay, there's a reason why I'm telling this story. I got to drive a Cybertruck. Now I'm going to give you just a little background. We actually had a guy that is doing a private label beer. It's actually a gift by his wife to him. He's a retired dude. She's like, he does a ton of entertainment. And she's like, I want to get him a private label beer. So yesterday, this guy came in and he brought 3 friends and we sat down and we gave him the tour and we tasted beers. And basically we were going to design this custom beer for his private label. So far, so good. I actually met this guy once 10 years ago when I first came to Austin. So it's like, we're kind of friendly. I've got his number in my phone, but I haven't seen him in 10 years. All right? So he comes, and the first thing we do, everybody's getting coffee, and we're hanging out, and they're looking around the place. They're like, this is amazing. And I'm like, let me give you a quick tour. And we walk outside, and onto the patio at Lazarus, and I look over, and I see a Cybertruck parked. So what am I doing? I'm going to, I'm trying to keep everything light, joking. And I'm like, oh, which of you guys brought the Cybertruck? And the guy goes, it was me. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And so we start talking. I'm like, listen, I'm a Ford guy. I drive an F-250 diesel. And he's like, I used to drive a Tundra. But so he starts talking about this thing. Fine. We spent about 4 hours working on this guy's beer and had a great time. It was really great to reconnect with him. But at the end, we're sending him home with a bunch of beer so he can keep drinking different, really figure out what he wants. And I'm carrying beer out to his Cybertruck. And I'm like, hey, if I'm going to go out to a Cybertruck, I want to at least look inside. So he opens it up and he's like, listen, you need to drive it around the block. And he said it a couple of times. I'm like, you know what? I'm driving this Cybertruck. Now, why is this funny? Because about 2 weeks ago, we had, I think you were here, Mary Beth. We had some of the single women in the church over for dinner, and I asked the question at one point. I'm like, because they're all talking about who they'd like to date, and I'm like, would anybody date?
Let's clarify this question. This conversation started because Christian asked.
Okay, yes. We're talking about, and I asked the question, would any of you guys date a guy who drove a Cybertruck? Everybody's like, no way, except for Olivia. And Olivia's like, I'd consider dating a guy who drove a Cybertruck. So here's the thing. And at the time, I'm pretty sure I said something like, I would never be caught dead in a Cybertruck. So I'm thinking about this as I'm getting into the Cybertruck to drive around the block. It was weird, kind of cool, fun, but weird. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to have my head brewer take a picture and so that I can show it and you guys can make fun of me. And I'm like, oh, I'll post it on social media.
Oh, God.
Yes! I posted to Instagram, which cross-posts to Facebook.
Oh, dear God. Why do you do that?
Yeah, exactly. It's just me standing beside a Cybertruck, smiling.
I saw it this morning.
Okay.
Almost like Christian.
Yeah, exactly. Now, there's a reason why I'm telling this. It's really funny because several people, like, there were comments.
Obviously.
And the first comment was, it was like, and this is from somebody I barely know. And it was like, the swastikar. Do we take this as a signal?
Oh, no.
And then there was another guy that I knew from 20 years ago back in Philly who's not a Christian, but he's a friend. And he's like, he's very earnest. He's like, dude, this is not a good look. And I'm like, are you saying this is going to, and I asked it facetiously, is this going to hurt my Facebook stock? I'm never on Facebook. You're like, listen, I have 0 Facebook stock in the first place. I'm never on. I rarely post. Every now, like a couple of times a year, I post pictures. And he's like, oh, dude, this is going to kill you. All the people you want to reach, you'll never reach them by posting this picture because this guy's evil. And in other words, just by association with the car. Now, listen, the point which is implicit behind this, I think, is that there are some people that think what you post online is one of the most important, significant things you do in this world right now. And if you post the wrong thing, you will send the wrong signals, you won't reach the people you want to reach, and you'll get the wrong people instead. And I think there's a subtle implication, this is a guess, I could be wrong, but that if you do post the right things, your work is done. You see what I'm saying? It's actually reduced the work that we do. And I thought a lot about this because, listen, I'm not interested in a Cybertruck. But when a guy that I haven't known for years, I haven't seen him in 10 years, and we have a great conversation, and he's got one, and I don't get it, and he's like, jump in and let's... Do you hear the friendship there? I'm probably always going to say yes to that. And what's so weird to me is how our social media doesn't care anything about that. It's all about what's the picture, what are the optics, what are the signal. And I'm like, that is, I think, a picture, a part of what's wrong with our culture right now, but it's only one half of what's wrong. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So I want to start by you all picturing me, okay, in the Cybertruck, and you can all go on and leave comments about how stupid it is. Anyway, whatever. All right, now listen. That's my framing. You can all picture it, right? Okay. Let's talk about the nature of cultural narratives. I'm going to paint with a very broad brush here. But I want to point out that Paul is painting with a very broad brush too. In other words, he actually says there are 2 kinds of people on this planet. And then what he does is he pulls Jews and Gentiles, and he's actually saying, now listen, in one sense, what's a Gentile? A non-Jew. But he's actually saying there's something about Jews. They're doing something one way. Now, that's a broad brush. And then there's something about Gentiles. They're doing something another way. And he is saying both of those ways are wrong, or there's a problem with them, and there is a third way. Jesus is creating a new kind of person that doesn't fall into either of those categories. And it's not simply Jewish and Gentile. He's using those as an example. So I think the idea of cultural narratives can be helpful here. And here's what I mean by this. First of all, if you say, what is a cultural narrative? All right? You probably haven't heard this from your folks. They probably didn't sit around and say, let's talk about cultural narratives. I'll explain it to you. This will be good. Every culture has stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, what makes us special, what gives us hope, and what will make us okay. And we also have stories about what we think the problems are. This kind of people. They're doing this kind of thing. Okay? And it's not that the stories themselves are the cultural narrative. It's more the stories we tell flow through our cultural narrative. It's the air we breathe. Just full disclosure, every culture has more than one cultural narrative. There's actually a whole bunch, so I'm simplifying. But the point is, let's think of it this way. What's the cultural narrative for Jews? Think about your Bible. A Jew would, if you were raising Jews, kids, you'd be like, you are God's chosen people. He showed up to Abraham, who was a nobody. And he said, I'm going to make you a people. I'm going to give you a land. There's going to be as many descendants. You're going to be a blessing to the nations. Okay? You are going to have God's special presence. He brought us out of Egypt. He gave us the law. Okay? And now we got the promised land. Do you hear how that would actually be something that if you're a Jew, you're like, that's what makes me special. I'm a Jew. We got the law, we got circumcision. We have all of these strange, we don't eat pork. Okay? We have all of these strange rules. Okay. They're the stories you tell yourself and tell your kids that reinforce this is what makes you unique and special. Now listen, what would be the cultural narrative for the Gentiles? Anybody have any ideas? Think Roman Empire. Like, don't just think Gentiles. Think Roman Empire. Think gladiator. Strength and honor. Okay? Maximus, remember how he says that? Okay. Strength and honor. Now listen, that's actually a pretty good summary of the Roman Empire, but it's actually only true. Maximus, yeah, you have a question?
What?
Maximus, what?
What are you talking about?
Okay. Have you not seen the movie Gladiator?
Yeah, I haven't seen it either. It's a movie.
It's what the Romans
killing
did.
device.
Assignment.
Yeah.
Okay, Friedens. And, okay.
Kind of a tough one.
You're like, we went to church and got the assignment to watch Gladiator with our kids. Okay. Here's the thing. Gladiator, Maximus is a general in the Roman army. And he is really good at destroying things. And right before they take out these enemy troops, he's talking to his troops, and he's like, and they're gonna kick their ass. And he's like, but you may die. And he goes, so just remember, strength and honor. In other words, the Roman soldiers, we are strong, we are fearless, we do what's right, even if they kill us. Okay, now, from the movie Gladiator, you'd say, okay, that's kind of the cultural narrative. But what I want to add is, if you've also seen the movie Gladiator, he's just a general. There's somebody higher than the generals, the emperors, the politicians. And they're like, strength and honor, wink, wink, which really means if you've got enough strength, you don't need to worry about the honor. And you see that in the Roman, see what I'm saying? So there's a cultural narrative, but with a different set of rules for people that get high up to the top. But the whole Roman culture was all about, we are going to take whatever we want, and it's okay because we are strong enough to do it. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody? We hear something similar to that in our culture right now as well. Okay, so listen, the Romans would tell their kids stories to reinforce that strength and honor and sacrifice for the glory of Rome. And we're doing it to bring peace to all these stupid people that are too dumb to rule themselves. But we'll do a good job of ruling them. By the way, we'll get rich while we do it. That was the Roman Empire. Okay, now, that's the nature of, does that make sense when I say cultural narratives? America has a cultural narrative too. Land of the free, home of the brave. American dream. If you work hard, you can accomplish anything if you set your mind to. Hear all that? That's cultural narrative stuff. You can be whatever you want to be. It's cultural narrative. Okay. Problem with cultural narratives. This is the second point. Listen, on the plus side, you know what cultural narratives do? They unite people. They get them on the same page. They create a sense of, you know what, there's other people that think like me do, like I do. Okay, I'm not alone. We're part of a group. We're part of a team. I know I'm okay because there's a whole bunch of other people that think like I do. All right, so there can be a positive side to, if you have a culture that really values work, okay, guess what? They're going to be very industrious. America is actually very industrious. Okay? That's a good thing. Can be. Now, if you value work too much, it can be a really destructive thing, right? If you value profit too much, it can be a destructive thing. There's all sorts of things that if you value them too much, they're a problem. So the problem with cultural narratives is not only do they bring people together, but they also divide. Now, you see that, just take the Jews and the Roman Empire. Huge amount of conflict. In other words, the Roman Empire is taking over the world. All right? Nation after nation after nation. And here are the Jews, and they're like, by the way, sirs, we're really special. God gave us this land. And the Romans are like, who the hell are you? And they mow them over. And the Jews are like, no, this is our land. And they fight back. Okay? So all sorts of tension. Do you see the conflict that comes from different cultural narratives? But there's more than that. Listen, what's going on in Gaza right now is an example of what happens when you get conflicting cultural narratives. And part of the cultural narrative right now in the Middle East is you have Israelites who say there are no peace with Hamas still around. And you've got Hamas who says there's no peace with Israel still around. Can you see how this is not going to end well? So you do have conflicts that way. Okay? But there's another way that cultural narratives create problems. Every cultural narrative ultimately lets its people down. Okay? The real problem with cultural narratives is they never deliver all they promise. So let's think about this for an example. For 600 years, the Jews they've got this cultural narrative of you're special, you're God's chosen people. He's going to do something great with you. He's going to restore the kingdom, and eventually there's going to be this Messiah, and you're going to return to glory, and you're going to have the promised land back again. And what's their experience been like for 600 years? Downtrodden. They're small, they're tiny, they're a remnant. They barely exist. They're scattered all over the world. So listen, if you're living in that, you get this cultural narrative that says you're great and special, but your experiences, you get stomped on. Do you know what starts to happen? You start to question and doubt the cultural narrative. Okay? You see how the Jews, so by the time of Jesus, there are a lot of Jews that are really doubting the cultural narrative. So there's a lot of internal tensions about, listen, do we try to beat the Romans? Do we just join the Romans? Do we say screw everything and just be like normal people? We're just going to, figure out how to make money with the rest of them? Do you follow what I'm saying? Okay, now listen. The Roman Empire also lets its people down. It's got this narrative of strength and honor and glory and peace. But do you remember who most of the Roman Empire is comprised of? Slaves. Yeah. Okay, how well is that going for them? They're like, the Roman Empire kind of sucks. The Roman Empire is built on the back of slavery. It's built on the back of power. And that tends to be very good for the privileged who are at the top of the heap. But even if you are not a slave, okay, the government still asks you to serve in the military and go die for your country. And it is a hard life. And you're dealing with politics and infighting. And the rules change all the time. Do you see what I'm saying? And even the people, listen, in our culture, our cultural narrative, if you work hard, you'll get ahead. And if you get ahead, you will be happy. We are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world on the face of the planet, and we are miserable. Our cultural narratives aren't delivering the goods. Okay? So that's part of the problem with cultural narratives, and there are two basic responses to it. This is the important part, and this is where I think it gets to the Jew-Gentile thing. I think Paul is saying that there are actually two basic human responses to cultural narratives. Okay? One is you retreat. It's not going well. So you know what? You retreat, you disengage, you huddle within your tribe. That's exactly what the Jews did. They're like, okay, We don't have much power. So you know what? We're going to hang out with Jews. We're going to try to do everything in-house. We're going to get our sense of identity from our tight-knit community. Okay? We're just going to deal with ourselves. It's a very defensive posture. I would actually argue that's what's happening in a lot of our online circles today. It's a defensive posture where we're talking to our own little echo chambers. Okay? Deeply threatened by anything that, like, oh my gosh, Christian in a Cybertruck? Like, shocking. People are appalled. They're like, whoa, you're sending the wrong signals here. Okay, now listen. There is a second response. This is the classic Roman response. When your narrative is letting you down, you know what you do? You just go bigger. You go harder. You're like, oh, you know what? It's not going so well yet. Well, we'll just take over the rest of the world. And when the whole world's under control, then we won't have any problems in it because we'll be in charge of everything. Then we'll be happy. Okay? This is the approach that takes the offense. It goes on the move. It seizes. It wields power. That's what the Roman Empire did. Okay? And what I would say is there's a part of American culture today which is very much moving in the direction of seizing and taking power. So I think it's a mistake here to look at the Jew-Gentile thing and to think like religious people versus secular people, because I think religious people can also go on the offensive about taking power. We're seeing a lot of that right now. I think what he's talking about is there's one that retreats and huddles, and there's another that tries to force and implement. Okay? It's more about, are you insular and protective, or are you powerful and aggressive? All right, now listen. That makes sense so far? Christianity, if that's the case, is going to be something different. So how does Christianity provide a better narrative? I'm going to try to do this in 10 minutes. Okay? Turn to Psalm 105. You guys following me so far?
Yeah.
Except for the gladiator thing, because your parents, like, shelter you. Just kidding. Psalm 105.
I've seen the cover.
Please ignore everything I'm saying about your parenting. You probably shouldn't show them Gladiator. Not yet.
I like that show.
Who was your daddy?
Okay. Listen, look at Psalm 105. This is a long psalm. It's like 45 verses. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through it very, very quickly. All right, you ready? So just follow along. Okay, first of all, what's fascinating about Psalm 105, it is reinforcing a Jewish cultural narrative. This psalm, the first chunk of it, first 18 verses, 15 verses, actually gets quoted in 1 Chronicles. You're like, well, that's interesting. 1 Chronicles, what'd you say?
David?
Yes. Well, no, it's actually before David. It's Moses. Now, here's what you need to remember. 1st and 2nd Kings tells the story of Israel, but it's before the fall of Jerusalem. Okay, that's kind of the end. 1st and 2nd Chronicles retells the story of Israel, but it's after they come out of exile. And what's really, so in other words, they've gone into exile because they didn't follow and serve God. Now they're coming back to the promised land, and they're like, hey, we're going to retell our history. And what you find is they're emphasizing certain things that they're like, hey guys, we don't want to forget this time because we don't want to go back into captivity. And one of the things you find is when they're telling the story, when Moses comes into the promised land, he quotes this psalm. So in other words, there's something in this psalm that they think people should really pay attention to. And so let's look at the psalm real quickly.
The psalm wasn't written before Abraham, or before him, Moses.
It probably was not written in Moses' time. It's probably as they're retelling it, they're grabbing a later psalm that they've found very helpful because it reinforces the cultural narrative that they're trying to live out of as they're coming out of exile. And so they're kind of putting that as they arrange into, they're like, hey, when Moses came in, he sang this, and maybe he did sing it, but the point is they're emphasizing it at a later point and the King's Version doesn't say this. So it's new and it's different. So here's what it says in a nutshell. The first and second verses basically talk about God's wondrous works. He's done amazing things. Okay, and then in verse 4, I had this verse underlined in the psalm. This is really what the psalmist wants you to do. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his presence continually. Now, do you see why they would say like that was really important for people coming out of exile? Because the people that went into exile, the problem was they didn't seek God's presence. Okay, they were chasing idols, false gods. Okay, so there's this emphasis on like, listen, what's really, really important, you need to seek God and you need his presence. Okay, now look at what comes next. In verse 5, he says, remember his works. And then what happens is he starts telling them what God has done. And what follows, I'm going to give you the quick and dirty summary, are what I would call some signposts. Okay? They are redemptive markers about things that God has done and the people that he uses, the characters in the story. And I think what they're saying is, look for these kinds of things again. All right? Now I'm going to give you 5 characters. The first one is in verses 7 through 11, and it's about a promise to a founder. Who do you think that might be? Abraham. Okay? Look at 7 through 11. He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He remembers his covenant forever, the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his promise to Isaac, whom he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. To you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. Do you hear the promise? Promised land from Abraham. This is yours. Don't forget that. Okay? So basically, cultural narrative is saying you have a promise from God to your founder that this is your land. Second thing, verses 16 to 19. There is the way prepared by a forerunner. Who was the forerunner? Joseph. Look at verse 16 to 19. When he summoned a famine on the land and he broke the supply of bread, he sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. Where was Joseph sold as a slave into? Egypt, right? So basically, what he's doing, what the psalmist is doing is he tells this story. He's like, you've got a promise from God through your founder that you get this land. Second, whenever God does something, he sends somebody ahead of you, Joseph. Third, there is a journey led by a sign bearer, Moses. Do you remember Moses? When he goes into the land of Egypt, what does he do? He works miracles. And he's going to lead them out of Egypt. And if you look at verses 26 to 30, he sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They performed his signs among them, miracles in the land of Ham. He sent darkness and made the land dark. They did not rebel against his words. He turned their waters into blood, caused their fish to die. Their land swarmed with frogs. You remember this if you've read the story of Exodus. So he's saying, you get a promise to a founder. You get a person sent ahead to prepare the way in the land of slavery. You get a leader who does signs that brings you out. Okay? You get a door that is opened by a death angel. You're like, ooh, who's the character for that? And the answer is, it's the firstborn. Look down in verse 36. He struck down all the firstborn in their land, the first fruits of all their strength. So they're looking at the story and saying, God opens a door through death of the firstborn. That's a marker. Don't forget it. It's important. All right? The last thing, you get a people prepared by the desert. This is actually Israel. Israel is the final character. Then he brought, this is verse 37, he brought Israel out with silver and gold. There was none among the tribes who stumbled. Okay, Egypt was glad when they departed. The dread of them had fallen upon it. And then he basically talks about how God brings Israel out into the promised land. In verse 42, he remembered his holy promise to Abraham, his servant, the promised land. Okay, and then what happens? They took possession of the fruit of the people's toil. Ta-da! Do you see How that is like building a cultural narrative for the Jews. Okay, so here's what I want you to think about. That was a whirlwind, entire psalm. Okay, first of all, you see how this is building a cultural narrative. What the Jews are saying is this is how God worked in the past. Maybe this is how he'll work again. Look for these things, value these things. Okay, second, so you're a first century Jew and you've been reading this psalm for 500 years. How are you feeling about it? You're kind of like, pooh, pooh, pooh. All right? Where the heck is God? I'm not seeing anything. We're getting smothered by the Romans. Okay? You're miserable. There's been no return to glory. There's been attempts. There's messiahs that rise up. What happens to all the messiahs? Killed by the Romans. Okay. By the time of Jesus, many Jews feel stuck in the mud. Palestine is a cesspool of politics and corruption. Priests use their wealth to maintain their position in the temple. Kings are puppets under the Roman control. Okay, the messiahs that tried got killed. And all of a sudden, now here's what I want you to see. You are a Jew, and you are still hanging in there, reading your Psalms, and you're reading this as kind of a cultural, you're like, okay, this is our story. And all of a sudden comes Jesus. And you go, oh my goodness, we have a new and better founder. Do you remember what the book of Hebrews says? God says to Jesus, sit at my right hand while I make your enemies a footstool. That sounds like a promise.
Isn't that a psalm?
Okay, yeah, but it gets picked up in the New Testament, applied to Jesus. Do you see what they're doing? They're like, hey, we have a new founder. Okay, listen, there's a new and better forerunner. Hebrews also uses the language, well, actually, so does John. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish. The Son enters the world. He is a forerunner in this world of slavery for the new world that is still to come. Hebrews picks that up. Okay, so you've got a new, better founder, a new and better forerunner. There is a journey with a sign bearer. Remember what Jesus does miracles, just like Moses. Jesus gives a new law, just like Moses. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love me. Okay? There is a door that is opened by the death angel. What am I talking about? What? The cross. Who's the firstborn? Jesus. Firstborn of all creation. Except in this story, instead of other people's firstborn dying, God says his firstborn to be the ultimate sacrifice. Do you see what I'm saying? All of this language and imagery, if you are a Jew and you are steeped in this story and all of a sudden you start hearing about Jesus and you start connecting those dots, you go, oh my goodness, here's a new and better cultural narrative. Okay, real quick. There is a new people in the desert. Hebrews 11 talks about people who have faith are seeking a homeland. Okay, now listen. For the Jews, it's Psalm 105 all over again, but it's new and better and it's rolled up in Jesus. There's a new and better homeland. It can't be taken from them. It's not fully entered yet, but it can be seen and tasted. It doesn't depend on their righteousness. It depends on Jesus. This king doesn't die, or he won't die anymore because he's been resurrected. And he's going to live forever. And all that's asked of them, it's not go obey the whole law. It's like put your faith in Jesus and follow him. Okay. Do you see how that would have resonated with the Jewish cultural narrative? And you had people that were like, dude, I'm in. Now listen, what if you were a Roman? Because we had Gentiles that came in as well. If you were a Roman, to be a part of the Roman Empire, you were expected to sacrifice for the good of the kingdom. But here is the King of Kings. Would an emperor ever sacrifice himself for like common Roman troops? No. Here's a narrative where the King of Kings comes down and he's the sacrifice so that his people are spared. A Roman citizen would have been like, I'd love to have an emperor like that. I'd love to have a king like that. In the Roman Empire, oftentimes, if you weren't born into it, you had to pay for your citizenship. Okay? In this narrative, Jesus has done all the paying. Okay? In the Roman Empire, no matter how much the empire succeeds, it inevitably crumbles. It doesn't last. Here's an empire that says it's coming and it's going to take over the whole world and it's going to be eternal. All right? Jesus doesn't, now this is actually really significant. Jesus doesn't ever call Gentiles to like exit the Roman Empire. It says stay and work within it, but you're working for a new boss. Really, really interesting. In other words, you can keep your job. You can stay in the Roman Empire. You can continue to be a politician. You can continue to be a businessman. You can continue to be a soldier. But you know what? You're working for a new king now, and he trumps even Caesar. Okay? And that gives you a capacity to work within the system without being corrupted by the system. All of these things that actually really appealed. You could have a significant role as a slave, a woman, and a poor person. You didn't have to be royalty. You didn't have to be high up. Now listen, this new cultural narrative takes all the inwardness of the Jews and it drives them out to the nations. Matthew 28. Go to the nations, making disciples, baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So you actually see Jews become incredible missionaries. Instead of going into their culture, they're penetrating every other culture because they're Christian now. And at the same time, you see the Romans, who are really good at being strong. And what they actually start doing is using their position of strength to serve rather than to dominate. And what that does is it forms one new culture full of Christians from both Jews and Gentiles, where both of those cultures maintain some of the earlier cultural narrative, but in a way that it's not destructive now, it's actually life-giving. All right, last thing. 1 minute. What about us? It's worth asking, what's our cultural narrative? I think we have several, and we can talk about this over lunch if you want. I think you can actually see both the Jewish and the Roman responses. In other words, that inward retreat, disengage, go online. You see that in our culture, but you also see this, no, we're going to conquer. We're going to wield power. We're just going to run them over. They've run us over for long enough. We're going to run them over now. You see both of those impulses. I think both of those are dead ends. They are not Christian, or at least not first century Christian. Where does this one new man thing play out? The answer is in living rooms. Life together on Sundays, also during the week, seeking the shalom of the city, worshiping with people that God brings into your life, learning how to follow Jesus together through leaders and through one another. Listen, how did Christians overthrow Rome? By doing the living room thing. How are you going to change America? By doing the living room thing. In other words, don't be like, oh, we're going to change the political system. Do the living room thing. Also, don't just retreat to your online world. Do the living. This is one of the most important things you can do. This is the sphere, and that's actually what Paul is saying in this passage. Because the rest of Ephesians is going to be how we do life together. Because that's what's going to change the world. All right? Okay.